Nobody expected Rachel Maddow, America's calm liberal voice, to lose control on live TV. For years, her reputation had been steady, composed, almost untouchable. Yet on this night, in this studio, under the glare of cameras that never blink, something extraordinary unfolded. It began with a silence so heavy it felt like the entire country was holding its breath. And then it cracked. Not with reason, not with debate, but with a scream. Asterisk, the set was polished, the lighting crisp, every detail designed to project control. But as Maddow's voice rose, straining past the boundaries of calm debate, the illusion shattered. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, eyebrows lifting, jaws dropping. Was this really happening? The woman who had mastered the art of carefully measured words now seemed unable to contain herself. Asterisk, and across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, young, unshaken, almost eerily calm. While Maddow's voice spiraled into chaos, Crockett's eyes held steady, focused like a fighter who had been here before. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply waited, letting the storm play out. The audience could feel the electricity between them, one unraveling, the other holding her ground with quiet precision. Asterisk, in that instant, it wasn't just a talk show. It wasn't just politics, it was theater. And like all great theater, it carried the weight of something bigger, a clash not only of personalities, but of identities, values, and generations. The scream wasn't just a sound, it was a crack. In the image of authority, a slip that revealed vulnerability. Asterisk, then came the words. 17 of them, delivered by Crockett with the calm sharpness of a blade sliding from its sheath. Words that needed no shouting, no theatrics. Words that cut, deeper than any scream could ever reach.
Maddow froze.
The studio seemed to freeze with her. Asterisk, millions watching knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Social feeds lit up instantly, clips being shared before the segment had even ended. For some, it was vindication, for others humiliation. But for everyone, it was impossible to look away. Asterisk, and yet the real story hadn't even begun. What happened next left millions speechless. Asterisk. Why did this moment matter so much? Why did one scream, one clapback, and one televised clash ignite such a storm across the country? The answer lies in the deeper currents flowing beneath the studio lights. Currents of dignity, race power, and identity colliding in ways America could not ignore. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett was not just another guest on a political program. She was part of a new wave, unapologetically bold, unapologetically herself, and carrying the lived struggles of communities often sidelined in the national conversation. Her very presence on that stage symbolized change, a break from the carefully polished politicos who had long played by rules written by someone else. For millions of immigrants, for millions of women of color, for millions of ordinary Americans yearning for a voice that reflected their lives, Crockett represented possibility. Asterisk, across from her sat Rachel Maddow, a titan of the media establishment. For years she had dominated primetime, shaping narratives, guiding liberal America's conscience, and holding power to account with her trademark wit and precision. She had built her career on being the voice of reason in a sea of noise. Yet, on this night, in this conversation, something was different. She wasn't just interviewing a politician, she was confronting a generational shift. Asterisk, the contrast could not have been sharper. Maddow carried the authority of legacy, the weight of years, the credibility of mainstream visibility. Crockett carried the fire of insurgency, the hunger to challenge old norms and the refusal to be silenced. It was not merely a TV debate, it was a symbolic duel. Establishment versus new blood, media power versus political rise, tradition versus disruption. Asterisk, and the stakes were higher than anyone admitted out loud. To Maddow, losing control wasn't just about a bad segment. It was about risking the image of composure she had spent years constructing. To Crockett, this wasn't just about winning a few sound bites. It was about proving that dignity can stand tall even under the heaviest fire. That a woman of color could hold her ground against one of America's sharpest media voices, and not just survive, but shine. Asterisk, viewers at home sensed it too. The tension went beyond the words being spoken. Every glance, every pause, every sharp inhale carried the weight of history. Social feeds buzzed in real time. Is Maddow actually losing it? Crockett isn't even flinching. This feels bigger than politics. This feels like a turning point. Asterisk. And it was. Because this clash was never just about policy disagreements or political theater. It was about the future of America's conversation. Could the old guard maintain dominance by sheer force of personality? Or would the rising voices of a more diverse generation claim their space, unapologetically and permanently? Asterisk in the studio, Maddow leaned in harder, her voice rising, trying to reassert control. But the more she pushed, the calmer Crockett seemed to become, as if she had been waiting her entire life for a moment like this. The dynamic was shifting. Before the audience's eyes, the veteran grasping for control, the newcomer gaining it without effort. Asterisk, this wasn't just a TV clash. It was a generational collision of voices, values, and visions of America. And as Maddow's composure began to unravel, the stage was being set for something even more explosive. Asterisk because the scream was only the beginning. Maddow was about to be rattled in a way that not even she or her millions of loyal viewers could have imagined. Asterisk for years, Rachel Maddow was untouchable. She was the polished jewel of liberal media, the intellectual darling who could weave policy into storytelling and make late-night audiences feel both informed and inspired. With her trademark glasses, her calm cadence, and her sly wit, she commanded respect. Viewers trusted her not just as a commentator, but as a guide, someone who could explain chaos with clarity, someone who could steady nerves when the headlines felt overwhelming. In living rooms across America, Maddow was a fixture, the voice. That reassured her audience that reason and facts would always triumph. Asterisk, but reputations are fragile things, and time has a way of testing even the strongest. The very poise that once defined Maddow began, slowly to feel rehearsed. What had once seemed like wisdom sometimes came across as detachment. Her authority, while still powerful, began to reveal hairline cracks under the weight of a changing political landscape. Younger voices, sharper, rawer, and closer to the front lines, began to emerge. Voices like Jasmine Crockett's. And for all of Maddow's brilliance, there was an unmistakable truth hovering in the background. She no longer spoke with the immediacy of lived struggle. Asterisk, the contradiction was stark. Was celebrated for her composure, her ability to remain calm in the face of chaos. Yet in moments of real challenge, that composure was beginning to look brittle. The smile that once disarmed opponents sometimes flickered into a smirk. The pauses that once conveyed thoughtfulness now hinted at irritation. Behind the polished image of a calm liberal icon, a storm was brewing. Asterisk audiences didn't always notice it, at least not at first. Many still clung to the Maddow they had known, the steady hand, the intellectual anchor. But politics, like television, thrives on energy, and Maddow's aura of distance contrasted sharply with the urgency of new leaders like Crockett. For those paying attention, the shift was undeniable. Where Maddow was analytical, Crockett was fiery. Where Maddow dissected events from a studio, Crockett carried the weight of them in her voice. Asterisk, and deep down, Maddow must have felt it. The role of gatekeeper was slipping away. The center of gravity was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, toward a generation that didn't wait for permission to speak, that didn't tailor its passion to fit the comfort of a television audience. Maddow, who once thrived by pulling back the curtain on power, now found herself being challenged as part of the establishment she had critiqued. Asterisk. That tension simmered beneath the surface as the cameras rolled. Maddow smiled. She asked her questions. She maintained the air of control that had carried her for so long. But something about Crockett's presence was different. It wasn't just the content of her words, it was the force behind them. Crockett represented everything Maddow once prided herself on championing. Truth, spoken fearlessly. Dignity that refused to bow, and unpolished authenticity. And now, that very force was being directed across the table, not as admiration, but as challenge. The irony was almost cinematic. Rachel Maddow, the master of exposing cracks in others, was beginning to reveal her own. Every interruption felt a little sharper than it needed to be. Every deflection seemed to mask a growing unease. For the first time in years, she was not in command of the room. The audience could sense it. The subtle imbalance was tilting, slowly but surely, against her. Behind the smile, a storm was brewing. The intellectual armor was thinning, the polished, calm beginning to fray. And as the debate pressed forward, it became clear that Maddow was not simply facing a guest. She was facing a new kind of rival, one who carried the authenticity of lived struggle, one who was not afraid of confrontation, one who would not be diminished by a raised voice or a dismissive gesture. And when Crockett entered the frame, Maddow's composure began to collapse. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin under the bright studio lights. It began far from the glamour of cable news, in courtrooms that smelled of paper and sweat, in neighborhoods too often overlooked, and in the quiet determination of someone who understood from the very start that dignity isn't given, it's fought for. Born into modest circumstances, Crockett never had the luxury of assuming the system would work for her. She saw up close how justice was unevenly applied. She watched neighbors, friends, even family members navigate a maze designed to keep them down. While others turned away, Crockett leaned in. She studied harder, fought harder, and dreamed of standing in spaces where her presence alone would challenge the status quo. It was in the courtroom where her sharpness first drew notice. As a defense attorney, she learned the art of precision. Every word mattered, every pause had weight. She knew when to let silence linger and when to strike with force. Clients who had been written off by society suddenly had a fighter in there. Corner someone who didn't just speak for them, but spoke with them. Judges noticed it. Opposing counsel noticed it. The community noticed it too. Crockett was not just practicing law, she was rewriting the way power was contested, one case at a time. But the battles weren't only legal, they were personal. She faced skepticism at every turn, too young, too bold, too unwilling to play by the unspoken rules. Yet every dismissal only fueled her resolve. She understood something vital. The very things critics saw as flaws were her greatest weapons. Her youth meant energy. Her boldness meant authenticity. Her refusal to play by the rules meant she was playing for something larger than herself. That spirit carried her into politics. In a system dominated by seasoned insiders, Crockett's voice cut through like fresh air. She didn't dress her speeches in the safe, poll-tested language that numbed so many others. She spoke with urgency, with conviction, with the rawness of someone who had been in the trenches. Voters saw themselves in her cadence, in her fire, in her refusal to bow. For communities often ignored, she was proof that someone like them could rise, not by conforming, but by standing firm in identity and truth. It wasn't just her words, though. It was her resilience. Each setback, each insult, each barrier she faced became fuel. She learned to carry herself with the quiet understanding that the world wouldn't hand her dignity, but it couldn't take it from her either. That authenticity made her magnetic. Where others performed, she embodied. Where others rehearsed, she lived. And so, when Jasmine Crockett walked into that studio across from Rachel Maddow, she carried all of it with her.
Ow.
The courtroom wit honed from years of cross-examination. The resilience forged from being underestimated. Again and again. The authenticity that resonated with communities searching for someone who didn't just speak for them, but as them. To some, it may have looked like an uneven match. Maddow, with her years of television mastery, her aura of authority, her reputation as one of the sharpest minds in media. Crockett, newer to the national stage, still building her presence. But those who knew her story understood something crucial. Crockett wasn't walking into that studio to prove herself. She was walking in already prepared. Every challenge before, this night had been training for this moment. Every dismissal she had turned into determination. Every courtroom exchange she had sharpened into precision. Every community she had fought for had built her into a voice that would not and could not be silenced. Asterisk, and that's why. Even as Maddow's voice began to rise, even as the weight of the studio leaned toward the familiar anchor of establishment, power, Crockett sat steady. Her calm wasn't passivity. It was the composure of someone who had weathered storms far fiercer than a raised voice. Her silence in those moments wasn't weakness. It was calculation. She was waiting, patient, deliberate, knowing the timing of her strike would matter more than the volume of her words. Asterisk, the viewers couldn't see the years behind her composure, but they felt it. They didn't know the long nights, the bruising, fights, the constant push to claim space in rooms that weren't built for her, but they sensed the strength it had forged. In a clash where one voice grew louder and louder, Crockett's stillness carried its own kind of power. Asterisk, nobody in that studio, not Maddow, not the producers, not even the millions watching at home, knew what was coming next. They didn't know that Crockett was about to deliver a clapback so sharp, so precise, so perfectly timed that it would echo across America. Asterisk, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke. Rachel Maddow leaned forward, her voice firm, words firing rapidly. Each sentence meant to reassert the dominance she had always commanded. She interrupted mid-thought, slicing into Crockett's answers with sharp dismissals. A scoff here, a shake of the head there, little gestures that over the years had cut other guests down to size. Asterisk, but this time, it wasn't working. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, hands folded, eyes locked, the picture of composure. But she didn't flinch. She didn't scramble to get her words back. She let Maddow speak, let her push harder and harder. The force of her interruptions building like a wave. It was as if Crockett understood something Maddow didn't. Sometimes silence is the most powerful rebuttal of all. Asterisk, the sparring sharpened. Maddow raised her eyebrows, mocking tone slipping into her questions. Do you even understand what's at stake here? She pressed, her cadence growing faster, her voice more pointed. Her trademark calm was gone now, replaced by urgency. And underneath that urgency, frustration. The smile that once disarmed opponents now carried an edge of contempt. Asterisk, still, Crockett held. A small nod, a steady gaze. The quiet confidence of someone who had endured worse than condescension on live television. She wasn't rattled, and the contrast was becoming glaring. The harder Maddow pushed, the calmer Crockett seemed to appear. Viewers at home began to notice. Why is Maddow so shaken? One tweet asked. Crockett hasn't even raised her voice. Asterisk, and then Maddow's volume shifted. The interruptions turned into overtalk. The overtalk swelled into outright domination of the floor. Her voice climbed, each sentence louder than the last, until finally it broke. She screamed. Asterisk, the scream wasn't long, but it was raw. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't calculated. It was the unguarded sound of frustration. Of a veteran broadcaster losing control in the one place she had always been master. The studio air thickened with shock. Producers behind the glass stiffened. The audience watching at home felt the moment rippled through their screens. Rachel Maddow, the unflappable, had flapped. Asterisk, and still, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't rush to speak over the noise. She let the silence stretch after the scream, let the weight of the moment hang heavy. In the air, she allowed Maddow's loss of control to echo, uninterrupted, until the very absence of her response became its own form of power. Asterisk, the longer Crockett waited, the more unbearable the tension became. Every viewer leaned forward, waiting for her words. Every second of silence amplified the imbalance. Maddow's outburst had cracked the image of authority. Crockett was poised to decide how the fracture would widen. Asterisk, finally, Crockett adjusted. In her chair, a slow, deliberate movement, her lips parted as if to speak. The moment carried all the suspense of a courtroom, the silence before a verdict. Asterisk, and then she struck. Asterisk. The silence after Maddow's scream was deafening. It lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, a pause so thick that even the hum of the studio equipment seemed to recede. Every eye in the room, every viewer glued to a screen waited to see what Jasmine Crockett would do. Would she respond in kind? Would she match the volume, the heat, the chaos? Or would she shrink under the force of a veteran broadcaster's fury? Crockett did neither. She let the silence stretch, seconds turning into an eternity. She leaned back in her chair ever so slightly, her hands steady, her eyes unflinching. Her calm presence contrasted so sharply with Maddow's unraveling that the balance of power had already shifted before a single word was spoken. The suspense was unbearable. The audience leaned in closer. The internet braced. The moment demanded release. Asterisk, and then, with a tone as steady as a scalpel, Crockett delivered. The line. 17 words. Perfectly timed. Not shouted, but placed with surgical precision. When you scream at the truth, all you reveal is how terrified you are of hearing it. Asterisk gasps rippled through the studio. The sentence didn't just land. Detonated. Maddow froze, her lips parted but no words emerging. The woman who had built her career on commanding the floor, who prided herself on always having the sharpest comeback, now sat in silence, caught off guard by the precision of a response she could not dismiss. Asterisk, the cameras captured every flicker of her expression, the flash of disbelief. The attempt to recover composure, the realization that nothing she said next could erase the weight of what had just been spoken. Crockett's clapback wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was devastating. Asterisk, and in the seconds that followed, the reaction began. Twitter feeds lit up like fireworks. Clips of the moment hit timelines before the broadcast even ended. Did Crockett just end Maddow on her own show? One user posted, racking up thousands of retweets within minutes. Another wrote, that line belongs in history books. Memes began to circulate almost instantly, splicing Maddow's scream with Crockett's calm, weaponizing the contrast into a cultural punchline. Asterisk, but it wasn't just comedy. There was validation, a surge of collective exhale from communities who felt, for once, that dignity had prevailed over arrogance. That's what it feels like to finally be seen, wrote a young activist. She didn't shout, she didn't stoop, she just told the truth. Hashtag sprouted, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag 17 words, hashtag truth over noise. Each one spread like wildfire. Asterisk, the studio audience, trained to maintain composure, couldn't entirely hold back either. There were audible murmurs, a shifting in seats, an almost physical wave of recognition that history had just been made in real time. Even those who came in loyal to Maddow felt the gravity of the moment. Something fundamental had changed in the air. Asterisk, Crockett didn't follow up with more words. She didn't need to. She had delivered the verdict. And in doing so, she had flipped the narrative on its head. Maddow, once the master of calm, was now the one rattled, undone by her own outburst. Crockett, the supposed newcomer, was now the embodiment of composure. Commanding the stage without ever raising her voice, asterisk, the brilliance of the clapback wasn't only in its wording. It was in its timing. Crockett waited until asterisk, the moment didn't stay confined to the studio walls. By the time the broadcast wrapped, Jasmine Crockett's clapback had already leaped into the bloodstream of the internet. Racing across timelines with the velocity of a cultural explosion, hashtags swelled within minutes. Hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag 17 words, hashtag truth over noise. Each one trended separately, each one feeding into a storm of conversation that crossed from political junkies to everyday people scrolling on their phones. At dinner, asterisk clips of the exchange appeared in every format imaginable, slowed down with dramatic subtitles, edited into TikToks with pounding music, spliced into memes, contrasting Maddow's scream with Crockett's calm. Someone paired the moment with the caption, "When they go high-pitched, we go high ground." Another created a looping gif of Maddow's stunned silence tagged simply, "That's the look of losing." Asterisk, but beneath the humor, something more profound was unfolding. Ordinary Americans exhausted by years of political shouting matches found in Crockett's words a sense of release. Comments piled up on YouTube replays of the clip. "This is what strength looks like." Finally, someone stood there, ground without yelling, Teacher from Arizona wrote, "I'm showing this to my civics class tomorrow. It's the difference between noise and leadership." Asterisk, the validation spread beyond grassroots voices. Celebrities jumped in. Actors, athletes, and musicians who usually avoided politics couldn't resist the viral power of the moment. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, 17 words. "That's all it took. Bravo, Jasmine." A well-known NBA star posted the clip with fire emojis, captioning it, "Mic drop of the year." Late-night hosts wove it into their opening monologues, replaying Maddow's scream before cutting to Crockett's line, letting the punchline write itself. Asterisk, the media coverage was just as relentless. Morning shows replayed the exchange alongside scrolling commentary from Twitter. Analysts dissected the rhetorical brilliance of Crockett's pause before the clapback. Newspapers ran headlines that read like cultural obituaries. Maddow meets her match. Crockett's 17 words reverberate. Opinion columns debated whether the moment signaled a generational handoff in progressive politics, a shift from media punditry to grassroots authenticity. Asterisk, and politicians couldn't stay silent. Within 24 hours, leaders from both parties were asked about the clash. Progressives hailed Crockett's poise as a triumph of dignity over bluster. Moderates tried to walk a careful line, acknowledging her sharpness while avoiding outright criticism of Maddow. Conservatives, meanwhile, seized on the spectacle to argue that liberal media elites had finally been humbled. But regardless of spin, the fact was undeniable. Everyone was talking about Jasmine Crockett. Asterisk. What made the ripple effect so potent was that it wasn't just about a viral moment. It was about what people projected onto it. For some, it was a symbol of generational change, a younger voice dismantling an older institution. For others, it was about representation, a black woman standing firm in the face of condescension and prevailing through composure. And for many, it was simply the catharsis of seeing arrogance punctured with truth. Asterisk, Crockett herself stayed quiet in the hours immediately following, choosing not to flood the moment with spin or self-congratulation. That silence only added to the aura. Her supporters filled the gap, celebrating her restraint as much as her words. One activist put it perfectly in a viral thread. She said it once, and that was enough. The rest of us will keep saying it for her. Asterisk, meanwhile, Maddow's team scrambled to control the narrative. They released statements emphasizing her passion, her decades of work, her continued relevance. But every attempt felt like background noise against the thunderclap of Crockett's 17 words. On social media, the contrast was unforgiving. Each polished defense from Maddow's allies was met with replays of the clapback, the line, echoing louder with every share. Asterisk, the spectacle revealed something deeper about the media landscape itself. For years, television had been the pinnacle of influence. But in this moment, it was the internet, the crowd's validation, the viral echo chamber that decided who truly won. Crockett hadn't just bested Maddow on set. She had outmaneuvered her in the very arena where reputations now live or die. Asterisk, and yet, for all the memes, headlines, and celebrity endorsements, the most powerful ripple wasn't visible in trending hashtags. It was in the quiet recognition settling in homes, schools, and communities across the country. The realization that truth delivered calmly could still pierce through chaos. That dignity, when weaponized, could be mightier than rage. Asterisk, the clip had gone viral, the headlines had screamed, the world had weighed in. But the true impact wasn't in the noise that followed. It was in the lesson. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett finally spoke. Not in a fiery press conference, not with a self-congratulatory victory lap, but with the same calm clarity that had defined her in that studio. She framed the clash not as a personal triumph over Rachel Maddow, but as a lesson about politics, media, and power. Now, this was never about me winning a debate, she told a small crowd at a community forum. It was about showing that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Asterisk, her words landed because they cut through the noise that had followed the viral moment. Where headlines blared about the scream and memes replayed Maddow's loss of composure, Crockett insisted on a different narrative, that leadership is measured not in decibels, but in dignity. She told stories of growing up watching people underestimated because they didn't raise their voices, and how she learned that silence, when chosen, can be stronger than thunder. Asterisk, the message resonated far beyond her supporters. Journalists who had covered the clash returned to Crockett's framing, noting how she refused to make it about personalities. Activists quoted her words in rallies, linking her restraint to a broader fight for respect in politics. Teachers played the clip alongside her follow-up remarks, contrasting the scream with the pause, the outburst with the clapback, and asking students what true strength looked like. Asterisk, Crockett's lesson was simple but radical in an era dominated by spectacle. Dignity is not weakness. Calm is not surrender. Logic, delivered with precision, has the power to dismantle arrogance in ways that shouting never could. By holding her ground without raising her voice, she had flipped the script on what it means to be powerful. Asterisk, and the irony was undeniable. Maddow, long celebrated for her poise and intellect, had tried to assert dominance with sheer volume, only to find herself unraveled. Crockett, a younger, rising voice, had shown that restraint could be sharper than rage. It wasn't just a generational collision of voices. It was a collision of styles, of values, of visions for how the next era of political conversation would sound. Asterisk, the inspirational crescendo came not in Crockett's victory, but in the clarity of her moral. In a world where voices scream, she said during a town hall weeks later, sometimes the quietest line wins the loudest victory. That line became the epilogue of the moment, printed on signs, quoted in editorials, repeated in tweets that outlasted the initial viral storm. It was less about the 17 words themselves and more about the philosophy behind them, that composure can be revolutionary. Asterisk, for progressives hungry for both validation and hope, it was a turning point. The clip had offered catharsis, but the lesson offered guidance. It reminded them that authenticity matters more than theatrics, that movements are built not just on noise, but on clarity of purpose. Crockett had embodied that truth, not with a scream, but with a line that echoed louder precisely because it was delivered with calm conviction. Asterisk, and as the dust settled, the clash came to be remembered less as Rachel Maddow's unraveling and more as Jasmine Crockett's emergence. The scream was a moment, the clapback was a statement, but the lesson that dignity can triumph over arrogance, that calm logic can dismantle even the most towering egos, that was the legacy. Asterisk, because, in the end, history rarely remembers the loudest voice in the room. It remembers the one that spoke with truth. Asterisk, Rachel Maddow's scream may have been the spark, but Jasmine Crockett's calm became the flame that refused to die out. One moment of chaos, one perfectly timed line, and the contrast was forever. Etched into the public memory, a media giant unraveling, and a rising voice standing tall in silence. Asterisk, this clash was never just about two women on opposite sides of a camera. It was about what kind of politics we want to see in America. Do we reward the noise, the theatrics, the shouting that fills airtime but empties meaning? Or do we honor the voices that carry truth, dignity, and strength without needing to scream? Crockett's composure reminded us that the loudest isn't always the strongest, and that truth, when spoken with clarity, cuts deeper than any rant ever could. Asterisk, and that is why this moment matters. Because it wasn't just television drama, it was a window into a changing tide, a generational shift, a cultural reminder, and a political lesson rolled into one. Maddow may have screamed, but Crockett showed that stillness could shake the world. Asterisk, if you believe dignity always wins, share this story. Let others see what real strength looks like, because the more we amplify moments like this, the harder it becomes for noise to drown out truth. Asterisk, and this is only the beginning. There are more stories, moments they never wanted you to see. Moments where power is challenged not by volume but by conviction. Stay with us, because we're going to uncover them all. Asterisk's truth doesn't need to scream, it just needs to be heard.